Manchester is famous for its bands, nightlife and footballing glory. But it's also the murder capital of the UK, with a murder rate 220% higher than the national average and 150% higher than London's. But unlike London, Manchester doesn't have the movies or TV shows to tell its gritty story. South Manchester is home to a vast network of gangs, each with their own names and territory. But one thing they all have in common is their allegiance to one of the two main gangs, the Gooch or the Doddington, based in Moss Side. Moss Side lies 1 mile south of the city centre. It's the former home of football club Manchester City, but is perhaps more famous for being the centre of Caribbean culture in Manchester. In the 50s, immigrants from the Caribbean settled in Moss Side, worked hard and built a close-knit community. But in the 70s, the neighbourhood declined after the government replaced the Victorian slums with the Alexandra Park estate, against the wishes of the residents. Estates are what the Americans call the housing projects, but just like in North America, they had the unintended consequence of destroying close communities, ghettoizing deprived people, and fostering a criminal subculture.
Manchester housed 13,000 people in a small area. But this style of high-density living had consequences that the planners hadn't thought of.
You are at least 30 times more likely to be mugged or murdered than the national average, and 3 times more likely to show clinical symptoms of stress.
In the 60s, scores of developments like this were put up in Britain, but they don't work.
After a violent riot in 1981, the area's reputation suffered. Unemployment reached 80%, and in this toxic climate, 2 gangs emerged to fill the unemployment gap on the estate. The Pepper Hill Mob, named after the Pepper Hill pub on the east side of the estate, and the Gooch Gang, named after Gooch Close on the west side.
It's a fact of life here that the black youth of Moss Side see the drugs business as their business, because that's all they've got. The employment position round here means that young men, young people are absolutely being degraded.
The 2 gangs were initially friendly, coexisting so peacefully that police turned a blind eye to their drug operations. But at the same time these gangs formed, in the estates of Cheetham Hill on the city's north side, a gang called the Cheetham Hillbillies emerged. Throughout the 1980s, the Hillbillies fought turf wars with the Pepper Hill, but maintained close ties with the Gooch as the leaders of both gangs were related. But in the late 80s, the Pepperhood declared that anyone from South Manchester that wasn't with them was against them, pressuring the Gooch gang to pick a side. Due to arguments over women and drugs, relations were already strained between the Moss Side gangs, but this situation proved to be the last straw. The Gooch ignored this ultimatum, so the Pepper Hill backed up their threat, declaring war on their former allies. An older from Pepper Hills said that if someone stopped to think, they would realise we all grew up together. He tried to explain this to his gang, but they wouldn't listen. In March 1991, Pepper Hill executed a drive-by shooting on a group of Gooch dealers, hitting a 14-year-old and a member called Darky in the head. Within 2 hours, Gooch members stabbed a man in the head with a machete. A catalogue of tit-for-tat attacks followed, including when the Pepper Hill cornered some Gooch members and poured petrol on them before setting them on fire. Battle lines were drawn, but nobody was prepared for how deadly it would become. Carl Stapleton lived on the Gooch side and on one evening visited his auntie, who lived in Pepper Hill territory. On his way home, he was ambushed by Pepper Hill members who hacked his body with machetes, stabbing him 15 times. Police say he was killed because he lived on the wrong side of the estate. The following day, the Gooch were out for revenge and chopped Delroy Brown in the head with a machete. Brown, with blood pouring from his head, ran into a nearby pub and barricaded himself in the basement. This was the 4th time he survived this kind of attack. Once, his rivals even tried to decapitate him in a nightclub. When police arrived at the pub, he was immediately arrested and charged with the murder of Carl Stapleton, along with his younger called Turbo. Earlier on, Turbo had his ear cut off in a knife fight, and the Gooch even kept his ear in a jar as a trophy. As the war worsened, it caught the attention of Home Secretary Kenneth Baker, who urged law-abiding residents of Moss Side to report gun crime to the police. But on this estate, moral choices weren't that simple. Many would rather go to jail for contempt of court than risk giving evidence against the gangs. One woman even took an overdose rather than attend court. The Stapleton murder trial itself collapsed after the key witness fled the city. The large police presence after Stapleton's murder caused a short break in the feud, until a Gooch member was shot in the face with a shotgun on the eve of Stapleton's funeral. The police chief responded by setting up an airborne armed police unit on 24-hour standby and meeting with community leaders to hear their concerns. But only an hour after this meeting, the Pepper Hill shot another Gooch member. The police then had the Pepper Hill pub permanently closed, and the remaining members relocated their headquarters to Doddington Close, calling themselves the Doddington Original Gangsters instead. More gun battles followed. Then in October, Doddington member Dabbs, on bail for attempted murder, was chased into a bakery by 3 Gooch members and shot in the head, dying in front of his friend Darrell Laycock, who became Doddington's most deadly young shooter after vowing to avenge his death. Carl Stapleton's cousin, himself bent on revenge over Carl's murder, was suspected of the shooting, but was found not guilty. Gang violence was now commonplace in South Manchester. Since the war started, Moss Side alone saw 21 murders. For perspective, that would be like if 160 people got murdered in Brixton. But the constant violence had taken its toll on the estate. Over 200 houses on the estate were now vacant. The police constantly raided the gangs, but the void was then filled by youngers who were even more dangerous than the established veterans. In August '92, there were 110 reported shootings just in Moss Side. Officers then noticed that the Gooch and Doddington adopted blue and red bandanas, allying themselves with the Crips and Bloods of Compton, and decided to send their officers to LA so they could be trained in gang tactics, but it didn't help. On New Year's Eve, officers raided a party. As they entered the building, a 15-year-old Doddington younger called Tommy Pitt fired shots at their heads, causing massive panic. In 1993, the Manchester Evening News dubbed the city Gunchester, a nickname that would stick, and 1993 was another bad year. On January 2nd, a 14-year-old called Benji Stanley was queuing for Jamaican food when a lone gunman shot at him. The first shot missed, so the gunman walked up to him, put the shotgun to his chest, and pulled the trigger. This particular murder shook the community. His innocent smiling photo in school uniform burned into the nation's conscience, and the national media descended onto Moss Side like never before, naming it Baby Beirut. Paddy Ashdown, leader of the Liberal Democrats, went on a fact-finding mission to study Manchester's violence. As he wandered into Moss Side, a teenager approached him with a submachine gun and threatened him to leave the area. 10 years prior, the country's third most senior politician being held at gunpoint would have been unthinkable. But by now, the unacceptable had become the mundane, as gun crime increased by over 1,200%. In 1994, there were at least 3 shootings a day. One occasion saw Lawrence Brown, who was cleared of shooting 2 Doddington men, shot after a car chase and found by police in a doorway. Another case saw Turbo chased by 2 Gooch members and shot in the chest. His body armor deflected the bullet, but later that day, he was parked on the estate when a hitman approached his car and shot him in the head. Police offered £10,000 for information on his killer, but still no one was named. In August '94, there was an attempted hit on the boss and founder of the Doddington, Ian McLeod, at the Caribbean Carnival. One witness said, bullets were flying over children's heads. 30 minutes later, Pitbull tried to shoot one of the men responsible, but his gun jammed. The Doddington were furious and started stockpiling weapons to wipe out their rivals. But before they could source all the weapons needed for the bloodbath, the leader of the Hillbillies, called the Gladiator, and the leader of the Salford crime family, called Paul Massey, intervened at the last minute to broker a truce between the Moss Siders. After several tense meetings, all the gangs agreed to stop the war. Anthony Stevens threw a party with all 4 gangs to commemorate the truce. The truce was also observed by Twilight and Juan, 2 original Crip and Blood members from Los Angeles visiting Moss Side on a peace mission. But the truce didn't mean peace in Moss Side, as a power struggle within the Doddington resulted in a civil war. A well-known Doddington dealer nicknamed the Sailor was shot at by another Doddington faction. Shortly after this incident, he got in a fight with the men who shot at him. At 26, Sailor was a veteran and had survived many attempts on his life, including one occasion where surgeons had to remove a bullet from his skull. But this time his luck ran out and he was shot 3 times in the head. His brother was also shot while laying flowers at the spot where he died, poisoning the optimistic atmosphere in the area. Not long after, another Doddington dealer was shot by a fellow gang member but managed to escape with his life. Later, his attacker was chased into his house and shot in front of his mother. Police flooded the estate to stop the 2 Doddington factions from massacring each other. But in December, Ray Pitt, the older brother of 15-year-old Tommy Pitt, was sitting in his car in Moss Side when a man cycled up to the window and shot him in the head, killing Pitt and injuring his passenger. Ray Pitt, known as the Pitbull, was the most feared gangster in Moss Side at the time of his death, and with him gone, his opponents within the Doddington thought that it would be safe to return to Moss Side. 2 days later, Darryl Laycock was walking through the estate when 3 men approached him. He opened his arms provocatively, expecting them to back down, but they responded by shooting him 20 times. Amazingly, he survived, partly because his attackers were using guns that only a top marksman could handle. After this, police took some members off the streets and the Doddington Civil War simmered down. Despite this, people in South Manchester were beginning to notice new gangs forming in the city, like the YGC, Younger Gooch, and the LSC, the Longsight Crew, based in the estates of Longsight and Ardwick. The LSC were Doddington allies, and Younger Gooch, forbidden from attacking Doddington, started troubling Longsight guys instead. In 1996, 17-year-old Longsight dealer Bigger was sitting in his car with a girlfriend when 2 Younger Gooch members shot him in the neck. His killer, known as Tintin, was arrested when a witness spotted him wearing Bigger's chain around his neck. The LSC was a young crew, with most members being no older than 15. Young as they were, they wasted no time getting revenge for the series of drive-by shootings deep in Gooch territory. The Gooch tried to hit back by spraying the house of LSC's leader, who was also the brother of Bigger. In March 1997, the Gooch ventured into Longsight territory again, but when they got into a gunfight with LSC members, one of their own was shot in the head. The member killed was Zeus King, son of the late Marcel King who topped the charts in the 70s. It wasn't long before Gooch turned their attention to their original enemies. A notorious Doddington veteran called Kevin Lewis was stalked by Younger Gooch members and shot in the head, shattering the truce. A month later, the body of a Gooch member was found buried in a farm with 2 bullets in his head. Armed police replaced normal beat cops, but shootouts between the gangs were still a daily occurrence. In 1998, Younger Gooch member Trigger was shot in the back of his head at close range. Miraculously, he survived and would go on to become a legendary Manchester rapper and an actor in Top Boy. Another lucky individual was Davina Smith, who was seen talking with LSC members while out celebrating her 16th birthday. As she got in a taxi, a man stepped out of the shadows and sprayed the vehicle with a Mac-10, hitting Davina in the head. She also managed to survive after part of her brain was removed by surgeons. But by now, these types of shootings were so common that the media had lost interest, and only the truly outlandish made the news, such as when Adatoro got into a high-speed gun battle with police after a failed armed robbery. While being chased, he pulled out an AK-47 and shot 5 innocent bystanders, including pensioners waiting at a bus stop, hoping the police would be forced to stop chasing him and tend to the victims. Heavily armed guards patrolled the courtroom as Adatoro was given 8 life sentences. 1999 got even worse. Gang members were working on another truce when a man nicknamed Remy from Gooch was shot by 2 fringe Doddington members. As he died in hospital, his Gooch friends swore vengeance, and when word reached Doddington that they were being wrongly blamed for his death, they decided to attack first, spraying the house of a Gooch member. Before the night even ended, there was a further 6 shootouts, as all-out war was declared again. Kids in bandanas began patrolling the streets 24/7. 4 days later, Junior was shot dead. Then Anthony Cook from the Doddington was shot 7 times in the head and body after a chase where he crashed his car. His pursuers then turned to the passenger, shooting him 3 times in the stomach. The LSC then riddled Longside police station with bullets after hearing that a rival was being questioned there. Shortly after, Gooch member Chris Soiree was killed when a hit squad pulled up beside him and shot him in the head. Police offered £30,000 to catch the killers, but it was never claimed. Several murders followed, including the shooting of Judah Dewar, a man with no connection